And we're back. It is Steve
Right.
and Daniel with Discourse or Death.
Yeah. We do the discourse so we can avoid the death. Welcome to episode 3.
Three.
Uh,
You
3.
didn't think it was happening again, but here we are for all
Here
5 of
we
you
are.
that
Oh, no.
watch this.
We appreciate every one.
Every one of you 5 people. We love all of you. And we're coming back to you today with some more professional equipment.
Yep.
We through our Patreon supporters, which don't exist. But you know, hey, we're doing stuff. So
those of you watching on the YouTubes, you see our super fancy podcaster mics. Look at them.
Behold.
They sound better. They look very nice. They are huge.
So hopefully we come in louder and clearer. And so today we're going to talk about anarchism. So this is a subject that I find myself increasingly drawn to and reading more and more about. And it's something that I always used to just kind of dismiss offhand, because what comes to mind when you think of anarchism?
Oh, it's just total chaos. You know, cats and dogs living together.
Yeah, like when I think of, or not now, but I think we're programmed to think this way. When you think of anarchism, it's like total chaos, right? And it's like, you know, people with AKs in the streets, just yeah. You know, and then they're like, there's like some third world country war zone going on, or what are those? What are those stupid horror movies where they have like the night where like you can murder people, like murder is illegal for 24 hours
The
or something. The Purge.
Yeah,
a lot of people think of like the Purge, and they're like, that's what like is going through their head. And yeah, I definitely felt the same way until I actually started reading about it, and I was struck with, oh, this is actually just like very libertarian ideas. Ultimately, is what anarchism is, and you've been reading about it a lot too here recently. So I'm really more curious as we get into it here how your opinions have changed on that. So, and I think well, first I'll just lay the groundwork, and then you can answer that question. So anarchism, technically, in the simplest terms, is really just a system of voluntarism. So the state, you know, the federal government in our case, essentially creates their own power through coercion, through violence. They have a monopoly on violence. So you don't pay your taxes. Well, you know, you can only get away with that for so long. And then somebody shows at your house and, you know,
not necessarily
can jail you.
When you get rich enough, as it has been uncovered, you can just not keep all of your assets and stocks. You'll never pay taxes on them.
True. But generally speaking, for most regular folk, you know, just being very generalized, and even the uber wealthy pay taxes, it's just they don't pay a lot compared to their income.
Right.
So anyway, this is kind of the general premise, is that through volunteerism, you don't have a state to monopolize violence, and so every interaction between peoples or groups is voluntary. So you're trading in the marketplace or providing services for people or whatever, but there's no overarching government that can say you have to do XYZ or we'll throw you in jail or kill you. And everything is then privatized after a period of time. So through insurance companies and, you know, private security and things like that, rather than having a police force or things of that nature that are state run. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Yeah, I'm really interested in your thoughts. How are you framing anarchism?
Well, it really depends on what type of anarchism we're talking about. As you know, I'm more SJW libtard lefty person, so anarcho-communism or so something that's really focused on the communal aspects of anarchism, and I think are also the most successful examples of anarchism that we've seen in history. Is something I can get behind. I still have the whole issue, well, what do we do about currency really if we don't? And I'm also thinking about this in the context of like, okay, well, how do we get there in real life as well? So like these are the couple of thought processes that I've had. Like, so there's a YouTuber called Non-Compete who does a pretty good, he did a pretty good presentation on how he would see it, and I agree with a lot of it. There are some parts I'm like, well, I don't know, because there are some things I think that unfortunately, for better or for worse, like a huge state has to do, because without a profit motive, it just won't get done until someone has so much money they can do what they want. So I feel like, this is a big topic, because one, I don't think anarchism can work with groups as large as our country. We would pretty much need to be like a loose federation of nation states, and everyone can just choose like, oh, well, I agree with these principles and I agree with these kind of laws, so I'll just really go to whatever American province has that kind of organization of government. But then which in theory I think is fine. It's just like, well, do we care about doing like the huge things like going to space and investing like in life-changing technologies? Because I don't think that's possible unless someone, be it a private or government enterprise, has like a huge amount of resources available to invest in those things. So if we can still have
Oh, well, I kind of wanted to use your thought process right now as like a jumping off point. So you said before that you think there's things that the state does that aren't for profit that won't get done otherwise. So let's dive into that. What are some examples of that?
If we're speaking profit, because we can also, if we can somehow navigate to a place where society just does things because they need to be done and not necessarily because they need to be profitable, then I'm like, oh, well, we don't necessarily need someone organizing our time and resources towards this common goal. If we could actually just agree on what the common goal is, if we could get there, I would be all for it, as opposed to being like some nation state saying like, we're going to go to the moon tomorrow, we're going to do it on your dime, basically. But if I look to history and just see like, well, we wouldn't have X number of things if it wasn't for the government investing in those things. Like, we wouldn't have the internet, we wouldn't have computers. Obviously, everyone points to the internet, the interstate highway system. Like, there's just a lot of things that would not have gotten done unless the government was able to allocate the resources to develop those things. I think maybe we've gotten to.
I said that's a pretty common argument.
What were you gonna say?
I said this is a pretty common argument that people will have when debating the anarchist topic. So the common thing is, who will build the roads, right? Well, ultimately,
not even necessarily. It goes beyond the roads, though. Like it's like,
no, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. Like you gave the examples of like the internet and things like that, but ultimately those things are still made by entrepreneurs and they're co-opted by government. They're ultimately taken over by the state. It's not like a bunch of, governors stood around like, oh, you know what we need? We need the internet.
Then what's the difference if it's entrepreneurs, quote unquote, who are working for the government versus entrepreneurs who are working for a private practice or whatever? Because the difference there is like, okay, well, if it's just random ass entrepreneurs, then maybe they wouldn't have had the resources to develop the things that the way they need to get developed. You know, if someone just came up with the idea of the internet and they didn't have the funding of DARPA, we wouldn't probably have the internet in the form that we have it now.
Yeah, but things get crowdfunded all the time, every day. You don't need,
Nowadays,
the government to do that. Well,
nowadays things get crowdfunded.
But that's the beauty of what I think is anarchism now, is because actually I think it's feasible now, where you could argue maybe it hasn't been in the past, but now it very much certainly is, because of technology. We don't need an overarching big brother to to reach into our wallets and take our stuff, and the police state to beat on people.
But at what scale can things be crowdfunded? Like, we see people who are trying to crowdfund like medical costs because they can't afford medical insurance, they can't afford to live, basically.
Well, just imagine.
But are we?
I said, well, just imagine. So I think you would agree that the federal government has a ton of money, right? And a lot of that money is poorly allocated. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of liquidity. There's a lot of capital out there for people to shift their investments from being taxed, getting their money robbed by the government, that could go into these projects. I mean, how much, let's Google it. How much money does the Fed have right now? So the government is spending, and this was just updated last month, $4.8 trillion. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that is an insane amount of money. You can do whatever you want. So I don't think, you could fund space flights. I mean, you could do whatever the heck you want.
If
I don't think funding things would be an issue.
We live in the reality we live in. Like, I don't see, if people had all of that money, funding space flights. I mean, maybe.
Well, enough people get into it, so it's just like anything. You're going to fund what you're passionate about. You're going to fund what you like. So, lots of people wouldn't fund the space flights, but I bet you lots of people would. And then as that technology gets better and better, I mean, people are going to want to get out there and start mining stuff. We're going to start mining asteroids and all this stuff. I mean, so in the future, if somebody with like a long-term vision would definitely invest in something like that, because eventually they're going to make a killing when you can mine some crazy thing off an asteroid and charge an arm and a leg for it,
Right.
So anyway,
hopefully. We'll see.
I firmly believe that, like, these things that we think, well, this is unfathomable. Like, we'd have to have some kind of government to do it. I think people would still do it. People would get it done.
I disagree, because then it's one thing if we're just crowdfunding things, but that doesn't work once you couple a profit motive to it, right? We're not going to crowdfund someone to go mine asteroids for them to be the only ones who profit from mining said asteroids, right? So we have
in a business model, it wouldn't be crowdfunding, right? Like, you would be an investor in that company, so you get some kind of return.
So that's so we go from crowdfunding, we'll do some things, to no, we are going to have a profit motive, and then we run back to the same problem where it won't necessarily get the funding, unless it's maybe 2 or 3 super billionaires who are deciding that it's worth their time to fund.
But how does that actually change it? I mean, just because there's a profit motive doesn't mean that people aren't going to want to invest in it. I mean, people invest in companies every day.
Maybe it will change if the government wasn't stealing all of our money, and somehow this $4.8 trillion was more equitably allocated amongst the general population. And it's not, a couple dozen billionaires who are deciding what's going to get funded and whatnot. I would be more in agreement with you. I'm just not convinced that would happen. Which also brings us kind of to the next point. It's like, well, what do we do about currency? And how do we get to a point where everyone is a little bit more on an equal playing field, to kind of decide where they want their money to go, right? So
roll with that. Do you have any ideas on what we could do about currency, like, say, in this anarchist society?
Well, I'm trying to, like, as I said, I'm always thinking, I personally think we need to get away from currency in general and just kind of have people participating in society, doing what they want to make sure that things run the way that they need to be run, and while still having the time to pursue their own interests. And I think a lot of that time is going to be reclaimed by automation, I think. So instead of people being replaced by AI, they'll kind of be able to work with AI so they can pursue a higher quality of life. But I think I'm trying to figure out, well, how do we get currency? How do we make currency work in any society where it's not one single state guaranteeing like, well, this is how much money is worth, right? And I got some other libertarian random YouTuber. Someone asked him, was like, hey, when was the last time that America has been like a truly free market capitalist society? And he was like, oh, well, probably before Abraham Lincoln got elected. And I'm like, all right, well, we had 8,000 freaking currencies, and then there is some other stuff going on that we won't talk about because critical race theory was last week or 2 weeks ago. So we've just, but yeah, and so you're gonna be hard pressed to convince me that just a truly free capitalist society is gonna make that work, because we already see the issue with, well, one, with Bitcoin. So in our society currently, it's like maybe 1% of the population is getting 40 to 50% of, I think 40% of profits and income right now. All right, well, with Bitcoin, currently 1% of Bitcoin owners own 40% of the Bitcoin in circulation in the entire world, right? So we go to a level of inequality that's literally hundreds of times worse than what we are already seeing. And you would see this with, one, we have cryptocurrencies that are springing up every other day, right? So what do we do about that? How do we decide, who decides, okay, well, this is the currency that we're going to use? And two, we're always going to have the problem of, well, the people who control the cryptocurrencies are the ones who started it, or the ones who got in on it super early. So we're always going to have this problem with distribution, right? Because even with Bitcoin, it's like, oh, if we wanted to fund an economy and a society based on Bitcoin, it's like, all right, well, we need people to have Bitcoin to put into the economy. Are we just going to take the Bitcoin from the 3 or 4 people who started mining it freaking like a decade ago? Probably not. So what do we do about that?
Well, ultimately, the market would make it work. I mean, the
How would
market's going to decide how it works.
How would the market decide how that works if only 100 people in the entire world can really participate in the market?
Well, that's a crazy exaggeration. Anyone can participate in the market.
You can't participate in the market.
You can't right now. Just because you don't have a majority of it doesn't mean it's not valuable. It's a silly argument. It's like saying,
how is that a silly argument?
It's like saying, listen. Nope, you keep cutting me off, and I let you talk for a while. All right. So it's like your argument is essentially, because Jeff Bezos has more money than anyone, we can't use dollars because he already has all the dollars, and now the dollars are worthless. That's essentially what you just said, but you said Bitcoin instead of dollars. But that's your argument.
But Jeff Bezos's dollars aren't guaranteed to be worth something because Jeff Bezos has them, or because there's any scarcity in them. The scarcity is really the key point. Like, Jeff Bezos's dollars are worth anything because the American government says they're worth that, and and it's coupled to oil or something of the sort. So we can say like, oh, anyone can just go and participate in Bitcoin, but no. You can't. You can't. One Bitcoin currently is worth what, $50,000? So you can't just say, just go buy a Bitcoin and you'll be able to participate in the Bitcoin-based economy. That's ridiculous.
No, it's not ridiculous, because I don't have a Bitcoin and I still have Bitcoins. You buy them in Satoshis; they're dividable. They're divisible to like the 10th integer. So
yeah, I understand. I understand you can purchase fractions of a Bitcoin, but then.
So then they're valuable just to that fraction. So you can buy them in like super. I buy them in small amounts.
But you need enough Bitcoin to sustain yourself, right? So people aren't just gonna. If we're trying to transition to a Bitcoin-based economy in significant degree. We need people to have enough Bitcoin to do that. So you can't just like, oh, well, I'll buy a Bitcoin here, I'll buy a Bitcoin there. Hopefully this $50 worth of Bitcoin will turn into $4,000 in 2 years or something. You need enough Bitcoin to pay all of your bills. You need enough Bitcoin to buy bread. You need enough Bitcoin to replace it with dollars, to replace dollars with it. How do we get there?
Well, I don't see the argument, because ultimately
you're saying everyone just exchanges their dollars for Bitcoin?
You could, and then ultimately, if you're trying to create an agorist society, so for the audience, an agorism is kind of like a branch of it's like a new libertarian thought. And it's a branch of anarchism. So agorism is essentially you're trying to create an alternate society through these new options, right? And so part of that is trading amongst each other and cutting the federal government out of things. And over time, the idea is that you will create a better society that draws more people into it because you're more free, you have cooler stuff, and you kind of phase out the feds eventually. So that's a very long story short. But one of the ideas that's floating around right now is that we can use these digital currencies to effectively do that, because never before have we had technology where you can act as your own bank. Okay. So we don't necessarily need to hold dollars in the bank and do that whole, traditional system that we're used to. We now have the ability to send money to each other digitally for free or very little cost, depending on what it is. And I don't want to go on a big tangent with that. But I think because of that, it makes the goal actually realistic, because you don't have to trade a physical thing. We have digital things that still have an inherent value. And ultimately, I mean, just like dollars, right? Is a dollar really like worth anything? Well, not really. But like you said,
the value is arbitrary. We just need to all agree on it.
Exactly. And as long as everybody agrees on it, then, you're good to go.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, for the system that I'm envisioning to work, my cat just jumped on the table. I'm using this little flimsy card table, so it's like bouncing around. But in order for the system to work, you're going to have something like that, and put your dollars or whatever your currency is, whatever country you're in, into those digital platforms in order to buy, sell, and trade. And then, I mean, I think you really could, as long as you had enough vendors, right? Like you could buy bread, you could pay your rent and all these things. And I think we're going to see that adoption really soon. I mean, because what's happened now, I mean, get out of here. What's happened now is, sorry, he keeps messing with this thing.
It's always something.
I know, it's always something. You're seeing big companies. I mean, Visa is like, they've bought a bunch of digital currency, and they're starting to roll out things. PayPal is now working in systems where you can actually send digital currencies back and forth. So I think it's the future, and I think everybody just kind of like strap in and deal with it. And
the problem,
you don't think so?
No, because ultimately my issue is still, well, there's two issues why widespread adoption with Bitcoin specifically, and I keep going to Bitcoin. I think because Bitcoin is like Rev 1 of cryptocurrency, right? I don't necessarily think that we're going to be trading in Bitcoin 5 or 10 years from now, just because, well, this is how everything in the digital world works. Eventually, Bitcoin is going to get to a point where it's technologically not compatible with whatever technologies we're implementing.
Eventually,
now, right?
For sure. Eventually,
Yep. And so that's a problem that we're going to have to reckon with literally any cryptocurrency. Also, I already talked about, I forget what the number, it was something obscene. It's like 12 people own like 40% of crypto. And so they can just, if 2 or 3 of them wanted to just, sometimes people just want to see the whole thing burn, right? And just completely flood the market with crypto, and everyone is investing in crypto at the time. Well, they can tank the value of it. And crypto in itself is inherently unstable, regardless of people doing like crazy marketing manipulation or whatever. So if everyone invests their money in crypto like today, and say they get like 0.1 Bitcoin, and and we see like a huge market swing go from 50,000 to 30,000, which we do. And I'm not sure how we stop that. Okay, well now everyone's money is worth less, and everyone loses purchasing power on a whim, and no one understands why. And we see that today. So that's another thing we need to figure out with crypto. Like if we don't have one, I mean, maybe it would be different if the entire world was on it, and so we like the governing entity is us as society could guarantee its value. But I'm still not sure how do we keep crypto stable.
I think, and that's a great point. Definitely a valid point. I think over time we'll see it kind of start to stabilize as it's adopted and actually used more and more.
Yeah,
And Bitcoin in
we
and of
we
itself is definitely seeming to be more of a store of value. So people call it like digital gold, right? Because it
right.
is so freaking expensive. And because of the network architecture, it's expensive to sell, or like not sell, but
Right.
like if I wanted to send you some and I sent you like $100 worth of Bitcoin, it
Yeah.
costs like 20 in transaction
And
fees.
and that goes back to my initial things. Like, oh, so we have this Bitcoin thing. It's supposed to be so valuable, and you're just like, oh, well, everyone just get Bitcoin. Well, not everyone doesn't have gold. So so if we're using Bitcoin as the store of value, which is doing a remarkable job of, then where do we go next? Because also the problem is like, well, we have 10 to 15 digital currencies springing up like every other week, just like
Mhm.
we did in the United States when we had 8,000 currencies, literally 8,000 currencies. Just banks just say like, oh, we use this currency here. We're gonna have, we kind of going back to our original anarchist communist society. If we have like a bunch of different anarchist nation states, well, who decides what currency is valid where as well?
Yeah, yeah, and those are real concerns. And I think ultimately we're going to have in the future, whether I get my dream anarchist state or not, where like all of these, because there's something like 4,000 cryptocurrencies right now, and that's, I mean, obviously that's
Yeah,
ridiculous, right?
right,
But
right.
I, but
And
it'll get
these are
weeded out.
teething problems, right? These are growing pains, and I acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's it's kind of like the dot-com bubble, right? You had like a million websites that really didn't do anything and weren't worth anything, but they were there because everyone was really excited about it. And
Yeah,
that's what we're doing with crypto right now. And as it matures, we'll see a lot of them drop off because ultimately the cryptos that will do well and are doing the best are backed by something.
what are they
Um,
backed by?
well, I'd said backed by something. That's not what I mean. They're inherently valuable because of the technology that they provide. So, like Ethereum is a thing because of what it can do and
Right.
its network. And really, the Bitcoin network, the Lightning network, is really useful as well, which is part of the
Yeah.
reason why it's actually worth money. And but there's so many of these cryptos, like like the Dogecoin. Love the Dogecoin, but
Right.
Dogecoin is silly because it doesn't do anything, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
It
just
has no
like it's
market.
just
It has no
there.
cap. Right.
Right.
And
There's no cap. It doesn't have a cool technology built into it like Ethereum does. Like there's no reason to have it. So,
right.
you
And
know,
there are a few like that. Like ADA is supposed to be on the come up. I know XRP is supposed to like revolutionize and so you're saying how Bitcoin costs like $20 to transact with. I think XRP is supposed to be developing some technology that brings this down to like the cents. So
yeah.
so yeah, there is some actual technological benefit to a lot of these cryptocurrencies, which I acknowledge. But then the problem is anyone who has time and the know-how can say like, oh, I want to make this cryptocurrency do this thing, and it can actually add this value. And we're still seeing, as you said, we have like 4,000 of them.
Mhm.
When do we get to a point where we kind of hit the all right, cryptocurrency can only be this helpful. So the ones that are here is what we got. um, and then the problem with that is like, well, the way technology is changing, like I don't think that's possible. We would have to have like some kind of quantum resistant cryptocurrency that's computed on qubits until we figure out how do we compute on octobits. And qubits are what quantum computers use to process information. They basically use to move ones and zeros. For anyone who doesn't know that, is like, well, yeah, how do we? Because if we're gonna have like a long lasting anarchist society, well, the currency needs to last as long as society, I would hope, right? So we've had dollars that have been around for however long. Do we just kind of agree that we'll have to phase out cryptocurrencies every generation, basically, as technology improves?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a very interesting point. I like it. But yeah, I think that is kind of how it would have to work. You know, just like
Yeah.
anything else. But I don't.
Right. But who makes that decision? If we don't have like some government or maybe some regulatory body of technocrats or crypto experts who are deciding like, well, we think that this is what makes most sense in a sustainable way, also accounting for like environmental impact as well, because that's the thing we need to talk about with crypto.
Well, I think each person would just kind of decide it, right? So, like, if you ran a business, and you're going to just decide what kind of payments that you would take. I mean, honestly, just kind of like, it's different, but it'd be similar to now, where well, you can pay me on Venmo, or you can like write me a check, or you can do PayPal, and but that's it. So then
Yeah.
a business would be like, well, I take Bitcoin, I take Ethereum, I take Monero,
Right.
and then
Right.
that's it. And so if the new technology came on board, then you would just say as a business owner, well, like after July 18th, we don't take Bitcoin anymore because that's that old stuff, and
Yeah.
it would just go down in value. So you'd kind of have to bail out to work with that. I don't know. And just like anything, right? It's not
Right.
like a perfect thing. I think, and I think we agree on this. There's no utopia, right? Like, I think
Right.
we have to try to design a system that allows maximum freedom and liberty for each individual.
Hmm.
Um, but along with that, I mean, you know, life has its own issues, and there's always going to be issues to any
Right.
system that
Right.
we have. Um, but yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. Like I
So,
feel like from a currency, like the currencies is always the thing that I wrap my head around trying to figure out, well, how do we work this? How do we make this work? How do we really democratize currency amongst all of us, right? I think like there do needs to be some kind of, I don't want to say like regulatory body that's that's representing a government, but we need the people who actually know how cryptocurrencies are developed and what good they bring to everyone. Like we need kind of like a brain trust of people saying like, oh, this is the best practice on what crypto is valuable, and if you're doing this kind of business, you should be doing this kind of crypto. Use this crypto or whatever. But it's just like, okay, how if even you have to acknowledge that's establishing like a hierarchy of sorts, which is kind of the anathema to an anarchist society. But I personally think it's necessary.
well, I mean, we
But
essentially, without, I mean, you can have these think tanks or trusts or whatever, and I mean, we have that now, right? I mean, there's countless
right,
people that are like Bitcoin billionaires that fully understand the technology, that can say, okay, this one does this, and this is why it's valuable. This is why Doge is not valuable, or whatever. I'm just keep using that as an example. That's why
right,
these 4,000 coins aren't really worth anything, because they don't really do anything. Um, but that doesn't necessarily have to come from like a top-down government thing. They're just sharing information, and because of the nature of everything, I mean, we can just look online, and you can become educated and research it. So again, I don't think it has to be like a hierarchical thing. It can just be people talking, right? Which is
maybe,
ultimately what I would call the market, right? I just use
right,
that term a lot, but the market will dictate XYZ. What's this people doing stuff? And I think that would be the case with crypto as well. I want to ask you one other thing, and then we'll talk about other anarchist
yeah,
principles and
get
ideas.
off crypto,
Um, but you said that, like, in your ideal system that you've been working through, currency wouldn't be a thing at all.
right,
And so, like, I always thought that was a cool concept, because
hmm,
obviously, like, Star Trek world, there's like the Federation doesn't use money.
right.
There is no, everything's just kind of like taken care of, and then you go pursue your interests and stuff like that, which I was like, okay, that's really cool, but like how does that work? Like, do you have any like framework, like how that would actually come to be, because like people's three motivations, as you know, are money, sex, and power. So if you just
Right.
take one of those motivations away completely, it's like, how would you get people to actually do stuff like in a positive way? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think we would need like a massive education reform, so everyone is one better equipped to realize their full potential. I think um, people would need to pursue a lot of these more, where we see like a lot of the really important developments in sciences like biology and technology, etc. People just need to be able to go and do that if they wanted to without there being like a huge profit motive. Because my problem, once you introduce currency in anything, it's going to get centralized somewhere, whether it's be it a government or the people who started the cryptocurrency or early adopters or whatever, or people who make some huge company and end up monopolizing everything. um
And that's
but
an
yeah.
interesting thing that you go back to a lot, is you have this very firm belief that like no matter what, in like if we're using capitalism, things will eventually
Yeah,
culminate into some giant
if
whatever.
right, if people can own, whether it's capital or resources or something, or anything holds value, people are going to try to amass that for themselves if given the ability. Like we just see this in most of human history, not all. Like there are some good examples of anarchist states where that doesn't happen, and we'll have to talk about that as well. But back to what would I see? What would I want? Yeah, it would have to be a point where, one, a lot of busy work, a lot of kind of office jobs are automated. So like there are a lot of things that are quote unquote necessary right now, but aren't actually.
Right.
And if that stuff is automated, you don't need to pay a robot, right?
But the robots have feelings too.
only if we give them, only if it becomes profitable for us to give them feelings. But maybe not. But yeah, so we would have to see like a whole lot of automation for like kind of the busy work grunt jobs that no one really wants to do, so people can pursue other things and other interests.
Robot burger flippers at McDonald's, which they already have, by the way. If no one's familiar, look that up. It's fun.
They're getting there. They're getting there.
So essentially, in the Star Trek system definitely has this, and you essentially, to make that work in my mind, then you would have to have complete top-down governmental control of everything, to say like, this is how we're going to allocate things, this is how we run our society, because those things are still going to need done. So without money, you kind of have to have like a person or a council or whatever that dictates the flow of everything. Like, for example,
not necessarily, because not everyone needs every resource. So if we have, for instance, we have like all these rare earth minerals, that are being hoarded, and we don't really know what to do, how to allocate that stuff effectively. I think the average person, if food, shelter, and clothing wasn't hugely needed to be fought for as much, I don't think there would be as many fights over like, who gets what resource, if it's just more freely available, because it can be freely available. Like we make, how much food do we make in this country per year that just kind of goes to waste?
Oh yeah, a ton.
And if people just can eat that food when they're hungry, I think that knocks out a lot of the things that people would historically be fighting over.
Oh, I don't disagree, but that's also what I'm getting at, is like, you're still going to need a group of people to decide what people get. Like, how much food do people get? Like,
once again,
you're not just going to have it like out in abundance and you just go into Walmart and get whatever you want, because also people are, unless we just had some crazy mindset change. I mean, people are, inherently usually kind of greedy, so you're going to get more than what you need, and then it's not going to work anymore. So you're going to
If
have
it's,
everything
well,
like rationed out to people.
as long as it's not too, you can have more as long as it's not removing food from someone else. Like if we have enough that people are eating, if someone wants a little bit more, if they're not taking food out of someone else's mouth, well, you know, whatever. But that's not what we're seeing right now. Like I think we would have to be hugely decentralized. Like I think a lot of independent if we have like all these different anarchist states or whatever, which I think, well, before I go into that, go into anything else, do you think an anarchist state can work with our size of population?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's scalable. I think it seemingly, we've seen it work in the past, right? So let's get into that, because we both read up on that. So back in the day, do you want to touch on that?
Well, we haven't seen it work with a country of 230 million people.
Right.
Right. So that means, so that's always my concern. So we've seen it.
It's my people.
There are little,
my Viking people. Yeah, I said it worked with the Viking people.
We got the Viking people,
which is
but
probably
they also traded in silver. And well, where do you think they got that silver?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like if we want, because yeah, we can get to that, but even more recent examples, there was an anarchist, it was during the Spanish Civil War, actually. There was like there's an anarchist state of, they're basically work fighters, and they're like, okay, well, we can't just do this capitalism thing right now. So so there was still kind of in hierarchy, but it wasn't based on pay or anything of the sort. It's like, well, in a military hierarchy, we need someone who's telling what everyone else does, and you go do it. But even the non-war fighters, it's like, all right, well, they're able to allocate food, money, and shelter to people for 2 or 3 years, I think, without there being like too much strife in the country. I want to say it was 8 million people there. And unfortunately, like this is like a week and a half that I was like really reading about it, so I've forgotten some of the details. But that's one more recent example where it's like a pretty much an autonomous state. Of course, they're also in the middle of a civil war, so that was less than ideal circumstances. But they're able to make it work for what it was worth,
which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And then to clarify for our 5 viewers, so the Vikings and my old Norse people, and maybe that's why I'm passionate about this, because it's somewhere in my blood. I don't know, but they lived in essentially what is an anarchist society.
Yeah,
and there were rules laid out to make that work, and they made it work for a long time.
They did,
and they were also extremely violent to anyone else. So there's that. where agorism. So agorism originally comes from this book, The New Libertarian Manifesto by Sam Edward Konkin III. Really, it's a short read, so I would recommend, if you're interested in the subject, pick yourself up this for like $10 on Amazon. Read it. It's really interesting. It just lays out how functionally you would make this society work. And then this edition is cool because it actually has his critics write letters to him saying like, okay, well, we like this, but this won't work. And then he writes back like, oh no, well, this is how it would actually work. So anyway, it's fascinating. But along with that, where am I going with this?
you were talking about your Viking
and stupid
who had a lot of different systems to make their anarchist society work.
So yeah,
upon threat of violence to everyone who wasn't in that system.
Well, that's where I was going. So the Vikings were violent with everyone else, but essentially, so with agorism, the prime directive, as it were, is there is no coercion through violence, right? Because that's what the state does. So
right.
So that you don't want to just create another state. So you can't use violence like at all. It's almost not pacifist because you can defend yourself if need be, because I think people always inherently, or some people will be violent. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that you're working through trade and voluntarism and not right. coercing through violence like any government can.
Right.
That was my point. So
Yeah.
it's a little different from the Vikings. So, but yeah, to answer your question again, I think you could make it work on a large scale. I just don't see why not. You know, and in your example, which was awesome, you're talking about 8 million people.
Mhm.
Could be more. I think it'd be all right.
Well, I think that it worked. Well, I'm also trying to think of like who was funding them, because I think they were getting some funding from Russia at the time,
It's always the Russians.
but I can't have to go back and look at this again. Like I think they were getting some funding from them, and eventually that funding died out, so they weren't able to. They didn't have resources to allocate anymore. And I also had something to do with just what was happening with the war. If we could see it, because also what I've seen with the example of the Spanish Civil War, and then also the example of like where we had mutual aid societies and lots of other kind of anarchist-based aid groups in America. It's always been in response to some terrible thing happening. So in the case we had the Spanish Civil War, in the case of America, where we had like all these different mutual aid societies and other fraternal organizations, you know, that was all in response to like the Great Depression and like pretty much like the largest wealth inequality divide that we've seen since then. So it's like, okay, well, if we can just make people do those things, like, so with the example of the mutual aid society, so basically everyone would decide to be a part of whatever organization, and that organization would then allocate, you had to pay a fee. It's like, at the time, I think it was $2 a year or something of the sort. It's like $2 a year, $2 a month, I don't know. And basically these mutual aid societies would then allocate those funds to people who needed them, right? So everyone's paying. Not everyone would necessarily get a benefit, but if you need it, hopefully there's enough resources there to help you out, right? It's supposed to basically help people out in like the very, very worst. And eventually they got to a point that they grew so big that they were able to hire their own doctors. You know, doctors would want to compete to represent these mutual aid societies because they, you know, it's a guaranteed paycheck, right? And so these mutual aid societies were basically taking care of a lot of people's day-to-day needs with food and healthcare and other things, and also like in these extremist situations, like, so if someone had like some huge injury and then they just couldn't work for a while, there are examples of these mutual aid societies just paying the dude's mortgage and letting him recover for like a year, right? But it's always in response to, well, the top 0.1% of the people who have all the money aren't helping us, so we got to help ourselves, right? But I think the concept is great. She's like, well, how do we implement that without it being in response to just terrible, terrible things that are happening? And that I don't see scaling to the size of the country, which is why I think we would basically need like a lot of different federated nation states that are loosely affiliated and kind of agree on a couple of key things, but ultimately are mostly autonomous, I think. Because I think once you get anything like that organized to the size of a country, well, we just, instead of having like the government, you just have like a big mutual aid society, which is
That's
just
kind of,
exactly where we are.
as you were talking, I was like, well, wouldn't that just be kind of like states anyway? And then you're just talking about smaller governments versus the federal government, and then so it's like you haven't really changed a whole lot, you know. Where like the ultimate goal of agorism especially is the elimination of the state, and that's the only way we're going to have maximum freedom. Because if you look at any government throughout all of human history, it could start off fairly well or not, but no matter what, the state is always going to grow. It always monopolizes its own power, and it always decides that it's time to, you know, eliminate people's freedoms.
So do you think that there is a place for these mutual aid societies? Do you think that there's a place?
I think that's a cool way to like, I think that's a cool way to start things, right? Mm-hmm. Mutual aid societies, something that's going on in the movement a lot right now are like farm co-ops,
Right.
and market clubs, because so the feds regulate everything to death, obviously, right? Which is part of the problem and part of the reason why I think we need to start moving in this direction. Um, so under the guise of, safety regulations or whatever, they'll say, oh, well, you can't sell farm fresh eggs because they're not bleached or whatever it may be. Well, you
Right.
can't sell milk from your cow to somebody even if they want to buy it because it's not boiled or it hasn't gone through all the proper processes, right? So now there's all these uh, co-ops
Well,
and societies coming about where you can buy this stuff and it's legal because you're going around the law because it's a club that you have to actually buy into. So it
mhm.
allows people to get these really healthy, all natural things that if you did it like totally by code would be impossible to do.
Right.
Right. This it
I'm a
wouldn't be
huge
any
fan of
difference.
co-ops.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm a huge
otherwise
fan
it
of
wouldn't be any
co-ops.
different than, the milk that you buy at the store, right? Because it's
Right.
gone through the whole process. So yeah, that stuff is gaining popularity because obviously we see in the country, uh, you know, all the metrics of poor health just kind of seem to keep going up, and part
Mm.
of that is because we eat crappy food, and so a lot
Well,
of
I
people
think
are
I
more and
think
more
there's
people are awake to that.
two problems there. Like obviously, our industrialized food process isn't really doing us any favors, getting us the healthy foods, right? If it's so much cheaper to eat at McDonald's and eat all these kind of lower quality foods, then well, that's what you're going to do. But also the profit motive is provide cheaper food for everyone at a huge rate. The reason why I think we need to think in smaller scale. But anyway, um, oh no, I completely lost my train of thought.
That is okay. I've done that once already. So
No. Oh yeah, because I want to talk about co-ops.
co-ops.
All
Let's
right.
talk about
Yeah.
co-ops.
So mutual aid societies for kind of replacing insurance to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Worker-owned co-ops. So wealth distribution at a capital like business level is more equitable. Like I think there's one of the once again kind of going back to Spain here. There's a worker-owned co-op. They voted that the CEO can't make more than 8 or 9 times than the lowest paid worker. So they in their charter there's built in wealth redistribution, I guess. But when it's done by the government or not the government, when it's done by the company itself and all their workers are taken care of, I'm super for that. But once again, can it work at scale?
I think
If
so. I just
if
don't.
it
I just don't
can,
see why not. I mean,
I think the
I think
business side, I think the co-op side more can. That's not words. I think I think we can see a worker-owned Amazon, right? I think we can possibly see a company grow to that scale, and it's not one person who's benefiting from the efforts and labor of however many million people work for Amazon, right? I definitely think that's possible. We just need to see it happen, I guess. We'll have to see. I wish I had more examples of other co-ops besides the one. Actually,
yeah, there's a few out there. I've seen a few videos. But yeah, I think they're mostly in Europe, aren't they?
Yeah, most of them are in Europe.
But yeah, and that in my mind anyway, would still um, be true to anarchist or agorist principles because you've got people that are working together for this company voluntarily. I mean, they're getting paid,
Right.
so we still have but it's a much more fair way, I think, of making capitalism work. And in these
It's
co-ops,
Mondragon.
you always do it now.
It's Mondragon is the
Hmm.
co-op that I'm thinking of. Go on.
So in that way, you have something that's actually you have something that's better for the workers, and you don't have a CEO making more money than God.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah. I think if we
And
saw,
I'm all for somebody like this. I think the CEO, if you start the company, you should make the most money because it's your company, right?
yeah, make the most money, sure.
But yeah, it becomes this level of like Jeff Bezos money that's just like ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
I have this handy on my phone, so I'll bring it up real quick because I just got this. Let's see.
Yeah. So the Mondragon Corporation is the worker co-op I was thinking of. It has currently 81,000 people employed. So that's pretty good numbers.
That's pretty legit.
Yeah, and it's 257 companies that are all working under this one brand, I suppose. But the Mondragon Corporation itself is the one who's kind of makes all the rules, and but everyone's able to vote on everything throughout the other different sub companies. So everyone kind of gets a say. Everyone sounds like they're treated pretty well. I would love to see more adoptions of systems like that in this country for sure.
I'd be willing to bet that we'll probably see more of that happening in the near future because I think people are. And I really think this past year of 2020 was really a big wake up for a lot of people where, we had this crisis event that, in my opinion, was handled really poorly, but we also got to see big government at hand, right? Where everything's shut down. You can't do anything. You can't go to work. Right. And I don't know how other people feel about that, but I think that was ultimately a mistake. We crippled our economy for something that's not any more dangerous than a flu.
Well,
but that was a good catalyst for getting people to think and realize, oh, well, maybe this isn't all it's cracked up to be. That's all.
Right. Well, I don't think it's accurate to say that it's no more dangerous than a flu, but it
is. Agree. And we should do we should do an episode on the Rona because the Rona is like, it's all nonsense.
All
nonsense. But we won't get into that.
We're gonna have to do an episode on that. We can say it was overblown, but to say that it's like, oh, it's just a flu, I think is highly irresponsible.
I'll just leave it at this. If you compare the death rate of the entire planet between 2019 and 2020, it's really not any different. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Okay. Back on track. So one of the principles of agorism I wanted to get into with you is called counter economics. So ultimately, part of diminishing the state is not paying into it anymore, right? So you do that through counter economics, which we touched on a little bit a minute ago through our talk on cryptocurrencies. But essentially, you're creating alternate markets for people, and it's just I provide personal training, so then people pay me for my personal training in digital currency. I use that digital currency to pay Farmer John for some food in digital currency, and then you just create this alternative sphere. So you're limiting state power over time with enough people, more and more people getting on board. Mm-hmm. You're not giving them the tax revenue anymore, so you're diminishing what they can actually do and spend. Did you look into that at all during your anarchism studies?
During look into what?
Just the counter economics.
Oh no.
Because ultimately, I think that's the way that we would wind up getting rid of the state. Because the end goal would be full independence for each person. One of my concerns, and we'll see what your thoughts are on this, with the whole idea, honestly, is to be an agorist or an anarchist or more libertarian. It's a lot of personal responsibility, right? Like you're acting as your own bank, right? With your crypto, you're usually running some kind of business, whether it be really small or large or whatever. Like it's just a lot of, you got to do this stuff.
Okay.
But the result is maximum freedom. You can do what you want, right? You spend the time the way you want to, rather than just, I got to check in at work for Amazon and move some boxes around and make $15 an hour, right? So you're just kind of a wage slave alternatively, or at least a lot of people are, you know what I'm saying? So
Well,
What I'm
even
curious
it,
to know what your thoughts are there. I guess my fear is that people tend to be kind of lazy, even when it comes to, their personal liberty. They're they kind of want an answer from government rather than trying to take it themselves.
all right. So in your example, even my example, I was trying to say, oh, but we need to have like a loose federation of nation states. Even in your example, you go to the super extreme where everyone is their own nation state, effectively. Everyone can do whatever they want.
Yeah, each person
As
would be
long,
sovereign.
right. So, and you think that can be done to the scale of a country where everyone just, all right.
I think so.
So we're going from, and this has always been my concern there, is like, so we go from the monopolization of violence to the democratization of violence, basically. So everyone, whose phone was that? I just turned mine off.
It was mine. Sorry.
Okay,
I'm
so
listening.
I don't see what is keeping basically the people who would have all of the resources and all of, because someone is going to have access to way more resources and way more capital than most people, I think. And even then I would ask, like, well, how do we get there, right? So for example, if everyone can just kind of do whatever they want, everyone's responsible for their own safety, security, etc. Well, right now, instead of having a federal government or any kind of government, we would just have the hyper wealthy would just have their own private militaries or whatever. That would happen right now if we were to just decide that, okay, everyone's fend for yourselves. How do we get to a point where that power of capital effectively is more equitably distributed so everyone actually can be sovereign at the same level? Like I don't see that working unless everyone can be treated as an equal to some extent. And as long as we have currency, there's going to be an intrinsic measure that makes some people worth more than others and therefore have more rights and more values at the expense of other people.
I get what you're saying, but I think we have to. I would. You have to like change the way that you're looking at it. So you're looking at things through a scarcity mindset. So there's only like so much money on the planet.
Well, there's so much of a planet, period. You have to look at everything from a scarcity mindset. That's another reason why I don't agree with capitalism. It depends on infinite growth, and infinite simply isn't a thing that can exist in our world or any world.
But
right?
We have a crazy abundant planet. So I don't think we need to look at things through a scarcity mindset. We need to look at things through an abundance mindset. So you can create more things with the abundance of the planet. You can create with what you know, or you can create with your labor, or you can create through your ideas or employing other people. So, and we agreed before that there is no utopia. So unfortunately,
Right.
because we live in the world, some people will have more than other people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that seems unfair, but a lot of times it's just because they've worked for it. They've got some genius idea that took off, or there's some amazing doctor that he's the doctor that invented XYZ. Well, that's why he's worth $500 million.
Or they inherited it.
So it's not like it's so it is kind of fair because they've created those things that brought value to other people, and that's why they're loaded. Now, does it always work out that way? No, but generally speaking, I think it does. So in an anarchist society, yeah, some people will still be crazy wealthy and some people won't, but ultimately it'll be on them to do that. Can they create and help people and get monetary return for that, or do they not? And that's ultimately the
Right.
thing. I mean, people just need to be okay with being in control of their own destiny in that way and bringing value to the market, I'm going to say again, or not. And if you bring enough value to the market, then you're going to get well compensated for that. I mean, there's countless stories of people now that I've met and or listened to that, I mean, came from nothing and now have plenty of money just through starting businesses, and they're not particularly special. I started my business. It's been a huge blessing for me and my family, more so than anything else I've done.
Right.
And you're a great example as well of like just working hard, using your knowledge, and now you're in a fantastic place, right? So you and I and these other people, we didn't look for government to provide for us. We just went out and provided value to people. We'll learn skills first. You got to learn skills. You got to be able to do something. But then once you have those skills, you provide to other people. You help them with whatever.
Yeah, but we are anomalous, right? We're also lucky in the sense that we didn't have like some terrible health condition, or we didn't get in like some kind of horrible accident. Like there are lots of things that we don't have any kind of control over, which could radically alter what we would have done, right? I think there's plenty of people who were cut off from meeting their full potential based on circumstances completely out of their control. So you can't just like, oh, hey, everyone should just start a business in this idealistic or agoristic society.
And not everybody would have to start a business. I think it's good, obviously, but you wouldn't have to, because there's going to be enough other businesses that are big enough to employ people. I mean, and that's fine. You know, you don't have to start a business, because for a business to grow, I mean, you're gonna you need employees, right?
Right. Hey, but yeah, I feel like maybe we just place entirely too well. One, I'm trying to get away from the commoditization of people and resources in general, you know, because it's always all right. So, for instance, if we have two phone companies, and I think there's another problem. We're going to figure out, well, who determines who gets what resources ultimately, without any kind of government, and everyone's just like, you know, fighting for themselves. So say we have two phone companies, and they actually do need something that's not quite as abundant. Like, so we have like these rare earth minerals, which more and more of our technologies are becoming completely dependent on. Who decides they have access to these resources? If it's based solely on capitalism, and it's based solely on, well, who can allocate these resources, whether it's money or military power or whatever, to get that, we're just pretty much putting the onus of that balance on private organizations as opposed to a state. Like, I don't think you can look at it.
Yeah,
we're getting to a point where we can't see everything as a society of abundance. I think for like the basics of food, water, shelter, absolutely, and I think that can be done in a currency-less society. But once we start ascribing value to any one single resource, I think we just end up to where we are. Right. So we'll say like, okay, well, for instance, one of the reasons Taiwan is so valuable is because they have access to a lot of these resources, so they can make microchips or whatever. If it's just one area that has these resources, period, let alone us having the technologies to develop them, well, who determines that we get those things? And if they don't want to trade in our currency or whatever, then we have businesses here that just are kind of assed out unless they want to fund a private military to go take those resources.
Well, no, they'd sell the resources. Why else? I mean, they do that now, right? Why else even have them? They'd want to sell them to somebody. Somebody buy them. Somebody do stuff with them.
Right.
I don't see how your argument makes it not work.
If they don't want, what if they don't want to sell them to you? Right. So
they don't have to sell them to you then. I mean, I don't have. If you really want my Game Boy, you really want my Game Boy. I don't have to sell you my Game Boy. You know what I mean?
Right. You don't. But then who's to keep them from just coming to take it? Which is kind of what
so that's a great point. So it's a great point. So governments, they have armies, they fight wars, blah 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 blah. So
I was wasn't even trying to get to that point, but yeah,
in,
it's a
in,
good
an,
segue.
in an anarchist society, you would have private security forces. So again, going back to the peaceful overarching nature of agorism, like these are not for attacking people and taking resources, but realizing that people are flawed and we have enacted violence on people or each other rather since the dawn of time, you have security forces that do just that, provide security. And you would also have so that would be very important for businesses and individuals both. And that could go back to what you were talking about earlier, um, the co-ops and the groups. Well, the security force would just be, it could either be more like a militia where it's
Right.
just a voluntary thing, and then if something happens to one of your neighbors, like you're the militia of XYZ, something happens to your neighbors, it's all agreed upon that you will actually come to each other's aid.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
it could, and I don't think it has to be mutually exclusive. You would probably have both things working. So for your poorer people would probably be parts of militias in the area that they're in, and then they would help come to common defense because of that. And then your richer people would probably have private security forces.
Right.
And but
once again,
but then I think it's, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. I just wanted to get this point out.
Yeah.
But part of the brilliance there is, so with governments now, it's it's semi easy for the president of whatever to just decide, well, we're going to war with this third world country, we're just going to go kick the crap out of them, because it's not his money, it's not his sons and daughters that are on the line to potentially die in said war.
Right.
But if you were a part of a militia, well, do you really want to get in a fight with the other militia? Because like, you could actually die, your sons or daughters could actually die, your neighbors could actually die. And even in a private security force, like if rich guy Jeff Bezos has this giant security force and he just decides, well, I'm going to go fight whatever, well, now the onus is actually still on those private security forces. Does that business actually want to go risk themselves for whatever Jeff is after? Their interests don't necessarily have to align. They could say, well, screw you, Jeff, like we have enough customers, like we're not going to go fight them and potentially get killed over it. Like that seems kind of stupid. So in my opinion, you would see more peace just because you have real stakes in the game now. You don't, it's not this like, well, just go send the troops. And in our blind patriotism, people, and we always get brainwashed into, whatever war. So like, I think Iraq is a good example because there were no weapons of mass destruction. That was all nonsense that the Bush administration came up with to justify the war. Good old Dick Cheney.
Before that, basically most wars we've been in since World War II have been based on some kind of deception.
Yeah, it's all deception. I mean, Vietnam, that was
Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Gulf of Tonkin, that was all nonsense, right? So we get everybody so brainwashed and mad, and they go in and fight in the war. 9/11, which we should totally do an episode on because we disagree with that. But in my opinion,
only to an extent.
Yeah, only to an extent. But
only to an extent.
I mean, in my expert opinion, 9/11 was pulled off by elements in our government. It wasn't Tao people that Tao hits Tao people. They didn't come out of a freaking cave with box cutters and take over planes and fly them into the World Trade Center. Sorry, these people were trained and much more equipped to deal with that kind of thing.
Whether it was our government doing it or the Saudi Arabian government doing it, that's to be debated. I personally think it may have been allowed to happen. I don't think it was complete. I don't think it was totally orchestrated. But that is...
Yeah, we'll just have to do an episode.
That's definitely another episode.
But nevertheless, that's just another example of the state creating some kind of boogeyman. And now we got to go kill the poor Iraqis. And then even though the terrorists were from Afghanistan, so... But never you mind that, citizen. You just shut up and you go fight these poor brown people over in the sandbox. Like, it's ridiculous. So anyway, I think that would bring more peace worldwide because people have real stakes in the game with
Yeah.
private security and militias. What do you think?
I think it always comes back to the scale. Like I think I'm all for militias. I think that's something we honestly need to encourage more, especially in this country, since we kind of have this out of control gun culture of which I participate. But it's always comes down to scale, especially when once it is defense and weapons, right? We don't want to have like one person. We don't want to have a Jeff Bezos who can basically buy off every single private militia or whatever. I think as long as it stays kind of decentralized and there's lots of them and there's lots of competition, lots of choices, it can absolutely work.
Yeah. And I think I'm sorry, go ahead, finish yourself.
Yeah, my concern is always once I just see things kind of getting monopolized and people trying to consolidate power. Once there's a profit motive, I'm always going to. Like, I think once there's a profit motive, you intrinsically want to take the profits from other people, and you do that by amassing more power, either by buying them out or maybe sending a private military over to like some people. But yeah, it's always like, well, what keeps this power loose and decentralized and even like super individualized? It sounds like what your ideal society is. Like everyone makes this decision on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I'm going to use that to segue into decentralization. So decentralization is obviously key to making an anarchist, agorist society function. And so one thing that the state has used forever is being able to control currency, right? Mm-hmm. And we see that now in prime example with the US dollar, as they keep flooding the market with more and more dollars because of the whole Rona thing. But that will inadvertently devalue the currency, right? Because there's just more of it in circulation. And we've been doing that since the 70s after the dollar got removed from the gold standard. So since then, the dollar has not actually been backed by any like other real value. It's just kind of funny money since then. Mm-hmm. So one of the beautiful things I think about agorism is decentralization moving into Bitcoin or insert favorite crypto here is inherently decentralized, right? Like you can't shut off the signal. You can't really do anything about it until we get some kind of God level crazy AI. Like anything short of that is not going to be able to actually like stop Bitcoin. So like the federal government couldn't just get mad and be like, I mean, they can make it illegal, but they couldn't ultimately like stop you from transacting in it.
Well, decentralization also works in a couple of different ways, right? Because it's one thing if the government can just print out money whenever they want. It's also another thing when, in the case of Bitcoin, when a dozen people own 40%, have 40% of the Bitcoin that is theoretically in circulation, right? So it can't just be like a government is the one who's backing it up. It also has to be like everyone has a close to an equal stake in the currency that we are deciding to use. Otherwise, you can just have a couple dozen people manipulating the currency to their own advantage, which is what we see with a lot of these cryptos. What we see with Doge is what we see with Bitcoin now. It's what we see with a lot of other currencies that as they're kind of going through their growing pains.
Right, and you touched on that before, and we'll just have to agree to disagree there because I think that'll stabilize over time, and then it won't be so volatile, and then you wouldn't be able to manipulate it as easily, right?
Right.
Like as it stabilizes, and then as we only have like a few of them rather than like 50 kajillion of them, then that'll help too.
If we see that over time, that would be great. That's just historically not what we have seen.
True, but we've also never had this.
I just feel. Yeah.
And so you could totally be right. I mean, we'll disagree to disagree. You could totally be right. I don't think it's going to go down that way, but it could for sure. I think is there anything else you wanted to cover in this particular subject or anything we covered very basics, what it is. We covered,
well, I did kind of want to touch on the Viking society more. So we talked about they live in an anarchist society, and then we might need to do a part 2 because we're at an hour and a half.
Yeah, I know. That's why I'm trying to wrap it up.
Well,
we can always do a part 2.
We're gonna say I do want to get some more thoughts. We're gonna say like right now we're just gonna call this part 1. Maybe part 2 will only be like 20 minutes or something, but I definitely want to touch on like a lot of the things that Viking society was doing that made it work.
I think that's a great idea. So let's do part 2, anarchism in Viking society. So we've covered what anarchism is in like very basic terms. Like this is not like exhaustive or really even like very technical. I'm not even using a lot of the proper terminology, but this is just how I'm understanding it. We covered counter economics and how ultimately through an agorist society without the idea is to eliminate the state by creating a better system outside of it. Eventually the state, because it always co-opts things that work better, it'll co-opt it at some point because everybody's just going to be on board. One thing I wanted to touch on real quick though, with counter economics that you see a lot of now is just simply not reporting things on taxes, right? Like if you sell something to somebody, well, the IRS says you got to report it on taxes, but who wants to pay taxes on stuff? Like that's just stupid. so there's a lot of like on smaller scale, you see counter economics with everyday people because no one's going to sell something on Craigslist and then decide that they want to pay taxes on it, right? So that's just like agorism in a very small degree that virtually everyone does. And we talked about digital currency a lot, how that could be the future of how these things work. I think it'll be fantastic. Daniel, skeptical.
I think I like I said, we just need to figure out how everyone has access to the currency. Like
y'all got cell phones, man.
That's all you don't all have $50,000 to buy a Bitcoin, man.
We don't need it. I don't have $50,000 to buy a Bitcoin.
You need 50,000. You probably need $50,000 over the course of the year to pay your bills, right? I mean, that's all I'm saying. Like we need enough Bitcoin or whatever currency we decide to use in circulation to make an economy work. That's ultimately what I'm
okay, and that makes sense. Yeah, because we'll have more than just the one. There's, like I said, Bitcoin will be like the store of value, and then you'll have other ones that are more spendable and don't cost ridiculous amounts of money that transfer.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So even if it's not,
there's growing pains, Bitcoin, we'll work through it. Yeah, if it's not necessarily Bitcoin, I mean, no matter what, you'd have to agree. I mean, we're gonna have a digital currency, right? Like,
we're getting
Chinese just rolled it out. We're working on it. It's probably already done. Knowing how our government works is done. They just haven't rolled it out yet. Like, I mean, it's going to happen.
Dollars are effectively digital currency already.
Exactly. Like, do you give cash to people? Like,
exactly.
Sometimes I do, and sometimes I receive it. But generally speaking, well, no. I mean, generally speaking, you just swipe your card everywhere.
Right. So, but everyone has it. That's my only concern. Is like, well, how do we get it in enough people's hands so everyone can sustain an economy based on it?
Eventually I think everybody could get crypto, but they certainly don't right now.
Right.
So do you think, I think an agorist future gives us the maximum amount of liberty possible. I think it's feasible. I think it's doable. Do you think it's feasible or doable, or not at all?
I think it's, well, I mean, I already explained my kind of utopia to a limited extent. I think it's doable at a smaller scale, like more focus on like local communities, and if we can scale it out so it's fair for everyone, sure. I'm more skeptical of that happening. Like even you were saying, like, oh, it has to be on the individual. So that's like the smallest scale possible. I'm just trying to scale it out slightly further than that.
That's really my hang up is it requires like the individual to really do the thing, and there's just so many people that don't want to do the thing.
Yes and no. I think that's ridiculous because humans are social creatures in nature. Like if we're just hyper individuals, we would have went extinct like eons ago. Saber-toothed tigers.
Well, it doesn't mean you don't cooperate. Like obviously this whole, like in an anarchist society, you're still having to cooperate. Like it's not just all on you.
Exactly.
And we gave the example of that.
I think that's what we need to lean in on is the cooperation and the community and the helping one another and everyone helping
that's-
each other together. That's what we need to focus on. Not the like, oh, well, everyone is a super individual and your destiny is in your own hands, because it's not. You know,
No, I get
we're social creatures. We evolve.
I get what you're saying.
Creatures.
That's the marketing spin. I like that. That's good. Yeah, I think that's definitely more important. Cool.
All right. Well, call it marketing spin if you want. Like, mutual aid societies work because everyone is working together. You were individually made the choice to participate in it, right? So everyone was participating.
So it does both. I mean, you're participating in community, but you're also getting more freedom out of being part of the service. Yeah. It's a win-win.
Right. It's just when you use the examples like, oh, well, as an individual, just start a fucking business. That's where I get, it's like, well, hold on a second. That's where I get more prickly about it, I guess.
Prickly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was good. So we'll wrap this episode up here. Appreciate all 5 of you listeners for joining.
Yeah, it's probably like 2 of you at this point.
Yeah, no.
Everyone listens to it in parts anyway, so maybe you're
no one's listening at this point. So thank you all for listening, and have a good one.
Mm-hmm.